But before we start, please take a moment to give this video a like, subscribe to Happy World, and hit the bell so you'll never miss these great stories.
A wealthy man scornfully refuses to give a poor girl money for flowers, but he sees her later at his deceased wife's grave weeping and realizes who she is. Salvi was nervous and excited. He was back in Boston after an absence of 15 years, and he was about to do something he's sworn he'd never do: reach out to his wife. The florist he walked towards was rightly known as one of the city's best, and he knew he'd find what he needed right. Tulips. He just stepped inside the store when he was accosted by a beggar. The girl looked desolate and ragged. She was thin with skinny legs and under her two short skirts. Her bruised knees shone. "Please, sir, can you spare some change?" she asked. David frowned and asked her belligerently, "What's the money for food? Are you just gonna blow it on drink or drugs?" The girl flushed and said with dignity, "None of those, sir. I want to buy some flowers." "Flowers?" David cried, outrage. "What is a beggar wall with flowers? I tell you what, you go and work instead of asking decent people for their money to buy flowers." The girl turned her face away, but not before David saw that she was crying. He felt a little ashamed of himself. There was one person who would never approve of his attitude. Claire, and David wanted Claire's approval badly. He put his hand in his pocket to give the girl $1, but she'd gone. He got himself a bouquet of the most beautiful red tulips, Claire's favorite, Clear, the love of his life, his wife, whom he hadn't seen for 15 years. David and loved Clear from the moment he saw her dancing at a concert, her hands up in the air, her long hair swirling around her like a silken cape. He'd walked up to her, and they had looked into each other's eyes, and they knew he and Claire had married 3 weeks later. But he only broke the news to his parents when he went back for Thanksgiving without Claire. He blurted out at dinner, "Mom, Dad, I'm married." His father's jaw dropped, and his mother spilled a soda on her linen and lace heirloom tablecloth. What to whom they would smile nervously. "Her name is Claire Farrell." I mean, it was she's Clear selfie. Now she's beautiful, funny, and smart. She's a law student. Who's your family? As David's mother. "Where do they come from?" "Well, she was an orphan mom," David explained. "She was raised by nuns in an orphanage." An orphan asked, his dad frowning. "That doesn't seem to be the sort of girl we expected you to marry." "David, Dad, Mom, I love her." David, crying, "I'm not marrying her family, whoever they might be." David's parents were furious. They demanded that he drive right back to Boston, fetch that girl, so they could take a look at her. "I don't want you mistreating your mom." David cried, "She's my wife. I like to think I know how to behave." "David," Mrs. Salvi said, but the way she pressed her lips together told him Claire was in for an ordeal. That night, David phoned Clear and told her that his parents wanted to meet her. "Oh," Claire said softly, "I can tell from your voice things didn't go so well. You know what they're like." David said, embarrassed, "But I know when they meet you, they'll love you." There was a long silence. That Claire said in a shy voice, "I hope to love their grandchild." "I'm sure." David started to say that and hit him. "Maybe you're pregnant." "I'm sorry, David. I was so careful, and I know it's not the right time." But David had tears running down his face. "Oh, babe, I'm so happy. I love you, Claire." The next morning, David got into his car early and started the 3-hour drive to Boston to fetch Claire. He wanted to tell his parents about the baby, but he decided to wait until Claire was there. Unfortunately, he never made it to Boston. An 18-wheeler spun out of control and spun David's car into a ravine. It would be 2 long years before he woke up. He saw his mother sitting by his bed, looking very thin and worried. "Mom, what happened?" His mother explained that he'd been in a terrible accident and they nearly despaired for his life. "Claire," David guessed. "What about Claire?" Mrs. Salvi looked very sad. "I'm sorry, David. When we told her you were in a coma and might not wake up, she just left." But David's head was spinning. "But what about the baby?" "Oh, my dear," said David's mom. There was no baby. It was just a way to trap you after his mother left. David cried bitterly for all the dreams he now knew would never come true. Claire was a liar. She never loved him. There was no baby. It took a long time for David to come to terms with it all, and he never fell in love again. 13 years later, it was David who stood by a hospital bed. Holding Mrs. Salvi's frail hand in his, "David," she whispered, "I have to tell you something." "Rests?" Mom, David said gently. "You can tell me later. There's not going to be a later David's," Mother said. "I know that, and so do you." "I lied. I lied to you and her." David frowned and asked, "What are you talking about?" "Mom, I told Claire you were dead," Mrs. Salvi confessed. "I told her she'd gone. I didn't know about the baby." David was stunned. He lied. "How could you?" David was about to shout, then he looked down at his dying mother's face. "Mom, I forgive you. I'll find Claire and the baby. It'll be okay." After Mrs. Salvi's funeral, David helped his father through the maze of legalities. Then he caught a plane to Boston. He was going to look for Claire and his child, and he knew where to start. "May I speak to Sister Frances?" David asked. "Did the Lady of Mercy orphanage?" He was steered to a sweet-faced woman in a habit who was playing with some children's sister. "Frances, I'm looking for Claire Farrell. I'm her husband." "David," said Sister Frances, stood up and stared at him. "You're David, but she thought you were dead," she exclaimed. Claire is dead. She passed away 5 years ago. She's buried at Evergreen Cemetery." "I'll tell you the plot number if you want to pay your respects." Claire's little girl was put into foster care, Sister Frances said bitterly. "We tried to keep her button. He placed it with her family. We lost track of her, a girl." David whispered and looked down at the flowers clutched in his hand, placed to have her favorite flowers. David loved the orphanage in a daze of grief and caught a taxi to Evergreen Cemetery. He started looking for Claire's grave and found it nearly an hour later. As he approached, he saw there was someone there. It was the girl from the flower shop. She was kneeling by the grave, pulling up weights and talking softly. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she said. "I couldn't get tulips today, but I have some daisies." The girl held up a limp little handful of wild daisies in her hand and placed it reverently on the gravestone. "Oh, Mommy, I miss you so much," David said. And the girl jumped up. "You're Claire's daughter." "Yes. Do you know my mother?" David stared at the wide eyes like Claire's and felt tears start to run down his cheeks. "I knew her. I'm your father." His daughter's name was Hope, and she had been on her own for 2 years after running away from a complicated situation in a foster home. David told Hope the whole story and begged her for forgiveness. "I'm here now," he said. "You'll never be alone." Again, together, David and Hope placed a lovely tulips on Claire's grave, and then he took her home to meet her grandfather.